Allora, well, welcome everybody. Hopefully it's not going to be too cold. Grazie Matti, grazie Tomasino. Okay, so I want to start from here. Can you see there's Italianness on the margins? Okay, so before we go any further, one of the issues when you do research is, and you publish a book, is compared with when you read a book, is when you read a book, you just go through the pages and you think, oh yes, the word culture, okay, fine, I know what it means. This is something you can't do when you write a book. You need to define every single word. When you start using it in the first place, okay, because we give words for granted. So, Italianness, the question is, Italianità or Italianness, what is it for you? Before any further, what do you mean by Italianness or Italianità? About Italy? Anything else?
Opera.
L'opera?
Regions.
Somebody said behavior. Behavior, so natural character. Anything else?
Regions.
Regions.
Food.
Dialects.
Okay, so vernaculars in general. Yeah, anybody else? Traditions is a bit like fiddle on the roof. Where do they come from? It's simply a tradition. We don't know. Anything else? Okay, now, this is interesting because what you just said to me confirms the biggest obstacle here. Italianness is considered exclusively, basically, within national narratives, with reference to the development of the Italian nation-state, Italian migration, and colonization. I have to say, colonization is a tiny little section of some people studied it. But Italian migration and the Italian nation-state are the two big things, hearing from you. No. So all these items you mentioned, more or less, fall within this category. But however, Italianness does not necessarily coincide with any of the above. And you may say, why? Well, that's exactly the problem, because we are brought up in a system, we are more or less brainwashed, whether we like it or not, and we think in categories, a bit like Aristotle, So we put people into boxes. The first thing we say, that person, I see John, oh yes, he's German. Well, is it important? No. But the first thing is to qualify people, you put national identity, which is a very dangerous thing to do. Because from that moment on, you've just labeled people. Not because it's not politically correct or politically incorrect, but simply you just assume that everything with John or Mike, whoever, coincides with that stereotype you got in mind. And we have a problem with that. Second problem that we have to actually face is the definition of the word culture. What do you mean by culture? Of course, there are so many definitions of culture, we can spend days actually reading them all. Okay, can you follow me from over there, or am I going too quickly? So, what is culture? Well, it depends on many people. Most people say, oh, yeah, it's the culture. They say, I'm going to study Italian and Italian culture. Now, I understand the language, more or less. You can say, ciao, buongiorno, okay. But what about a culture? And it's panic. The moment you challenge somebody on that, they say, don't know. Now, I take a step back, rather than defining it, because defining it, you can say, yes, it's about, you can give a working definition and say, oh, it's about, for example, expressions such as architecture, food and wine, literature, and language, and so forth. But let's take a plant. If we take a plant, the tree grows, the tree grows, okay, that's nature. If you look after the plant, that's nurture. And culture is about nurturing, after all. So the fact that there is a culture and you float in it like the lake or sea, it's just, in my opinion, it's complete nonsense. What do I mean by this? In the sense that if you don't cultivate, because this is where it comes from, Latin, something dies, or in any way becomes wild and just, it's no longer the cultivation of that. So it's like saying, oh yes, my father was an architect, so therefore I got that culture of the architect. Who says that? If you never practice it, you can't turn into an architect. You may have perhaps inherited some, of the traits of this person, but if you don't use them, what's the point? Like Mozart's son, he wasn't a musician. There you are, he never practiced that. So we got lots of examples of this, and the opposite is true. Now, let's move on to the next bit. So we said what culture is, Italianness, and then we got the next step here. So we got Italianness, okay, I say a journey through the Italian cultures. I'll get to the word Italian in a minute. But you also have the margins. Yes, I called it the margins because, as I said, most people think, yes, Italy, so they got the nation and the nation state. But the majority of people until the 19th century, didn't travel to Italy, the nation state, because it didn't exist. So they traveled until the 1797, they traveled to Venice, which was a republic, with its laws completely different. And Venice, for example, were open to Protestants, to Jews, well, to a certain extent, yes. And it was very different from other places where there was intolerance, where the laws were very different. So this notion of applying this image of Italy 21st century or 20th century to what it was before 1861 is just simply factually wrong. Okay? So we have a problem. So what we're going to see today is, if you want, is a remnant of what was meant by Italy before unification. In other words, different states with completely different systems. Okay? But there were some characteristics in common. The only thing is we had to be careful with saying, oh yes, they had things in common. This is what we think today, because we are brainwashed by nationalism. And we want to find a common cause, be it language, be it the flag, and so forth. And this is exactly the problem we have with this issue. It's like climbing. There's got a ridge on the mountain, and it's very dangerous. So doing research on this, there is a danger, A, of being, irredentist. Have you heard the word irredentist? So say claiming, oh, you want, On the other hand, you may actually get the wrong impression, as it happened to me when I spoke to Italy, oh, anti-Italian. It's either black or white. No, it's not that way. You need to be more subtle than that. It's like with music. You have to actually play, pianissimo if it has to do so, or fortissimo, so forth. You need to also adjust the way you interpret culture, so to speak, and be very cautious, not to actually, place labels all the time. The moment you start sticking labels to things, you're in trouble. This is the way I see it, at least, doing this job. Now, let's go to the bottom of this. Now, we got the word Italian. That's why I put it in brackets. Because in Switzerland, it's not about people who moved to it from Italy and actually moved to Switzerland and become Swiss, and all of a sudden, oh yes, but they are still Italian nationals. No, they're not. This is what a lot of people in Italy think, that the Swiss who actually use Italian as a language, for example, they are Italians but slightly different. No, it's not. Okay? And there's a good reason for that. Okay? Because the people who acquired a certain type of freedom don't want to be slaves of other people. Are you with me? They'll be actually subjected to laws that don't work. And you will see that. I don't want to spoil the story because I will show you something interesting later on. Hopefully it will make you smile a little bit. Okay, so we are to define, correct me if I'm wrong, the margins, so outside the borders. Of course, you've got realities like San Marino, which is inside, surrounded by Italy. The difficulty of San Marino is difficult to define. This is why when I did preliminary research, what is so specific about San Marino except the laws? And we don't have to, well, you're smiling, but we don't have to laugh at this, because this was San Marino was more or less Europe before the nation states started. Okay? So it's not that San Marino is an oddity. The nation state is the oddity, if you want. Okay? San Marino was more or less typical, perhaps less because it was a republic and there weren't many republics, as you well know. But at the same time, it's just a remnant of what Europe was before the nation state was invented. Okay, so we got other examples. You got the principality, different principalities around Europe. Liechtenstein, all these remnants. Very few. Oh, Luxembourg, for example, is a Grand Duchy. Okay, we can carry on this way. Anyway, so those are examples of this. Now, we'll get to the regions later on. Okay, and to show you the geographies of those. Okay, now. There's another problem here, because, of course, the first thing you associate with the word Italian certainly is the language, isn't it? But one of the biggest problems we have when we travel is we go online, we book a ticket, and we just choose the language. You're desperate for that, like alcoholics, aren't we? Okay, we're on a site, and, I say, crikey, I need to find the language. And the first thing you go, oh, that's a flag. And you don't reflect on the flag. But the flag doesn't represent a language. Of course it does. Well, symbolically does. The problem is a dangerous symbol. Not because it's not inclusive, as somebody told me. It's not about being nice. The fact is that the flag, like a lot of these flags, revolutionary flags, like the Italian flag, okay, originated a long time after these languages, became established. And so what? The problem, the flag represents a political ideology. Whether it is good or bad, I don't care. But it's still an ideology, not a language. Okay? So imagine countries where you share, dozens of countries sharing a language. What do you do in that case? Like imagine Arabic. What are you going to choose? Okay, it's not just that, but even the British or the American flag. And I thought, what about the others? Okay, French, same, German. I know people who tell in the hotel industry, for example, in Switzerland, and the people who design websites, they don't do this. Some people don't do it because they know that they will lose the clients if they do choose that route. So it's not about political correctness. It's not just about inclusivity. It's just about silliness. It's about stupidity in a way of associating a symbol so randomly, which some people are happy with, fine, but unfortunately it doesn't always coincide with that language. So this is the University of Oxford, by the way. Okay, a few years ago I gave a talk there, that's why it was left here. And it says, languages and culture studies, and the first thing you see is flags. Why? Why can't you just put a lot of words in there? This is a very cheap way of working, and this is exactly my problem with this. I really find it, from institutions in general, I find it quite pathetic, I have to say. Because, if you're, talking at the pub or inside the stadium, we're fine, nobody gets, but at academic level, you shouldn't do this, in my opinion. Okay. Now, another problem. You attach the word Italian or British or anything you want to a place, and then the next thing you're going to do is you take anything which happened hundreds of years ago, where the concept of nation didn't exist, or it meant something different. At the time of Cicero, nation didn't mean what we mean today. By the way, do we know what nation means? No. We don't agree with that. Anyway, the point is I'm trying to make is we use the modern, contemporary kind of viewpoint, and we actually attach it to historical periods where these issues or these concepts didn't exist. And this is one other problem. And what happens is that you take then, for example, a Roman amphitheater, and then suddenly, in order to take a picture, this is about this. You take a picture of that monument, and to publish that picture, you need to ask for permission. What? Yes, believe it or not, for certain monuments, you need to ask, you need to be granted permission by a government to publish something. I say, why? Exactly, because some constitutions, in some constitutions, the Italian constitution is one of them, they have articles embedded in the constitution saying that the cultural heritage is property of the central state. No, constitution, nobody actually more or less approved, by popular vote. Imagine this. And you may have heard of those crazy stories about, for example, works of art which people inherited and they cannot export them. And you think, why is it so? Oh, it's the bureaucracy. No, it's the constitution, I'm afraid, as well. Okay? So you create a myth that Leonardo da Vinci was Italian, in other words, which is a myth, of course, because he didn't have a passport and he didn't have the equivalent of a national insurance number. Okay? Okay, so codice fiscale. So we create categories. If you think, I want to make you think a little bit. We create categories, and we have to be very, very careful. Okay. So I know some people disagree with this, but at the end of the day, so here it was actually that there was a cultural appropriation. This happens everywhere, by the way. And you take something from the past, and you think this is ours. How old are you? Oh, 25, 40. 95, but this was built hundreds of years ago. Oh yes, it's my relations, No, hang on a second, you were not there. So our and us, I think, is appropriation. Because nobody from hundreds of years ago said, oh, one day Gabriele Paleari will inherit this. or the Italians, or the Germans, or the British, okay? But it's nice because the newspapers keep reminding us of us versus them. But think about carefully. These people are spinning in the graves. Say, crikey, look at me. Oh, dear. Hang on. Okay, so we've got this problem. So that's why there was a picture of the Temple of Saturn here in a book. And unfortunately, I can't show you the picture. There was a friend of mine who was actually captured in this photo with his wife. He was in Rome at the time. And he said, hang on a second. That's me in the book. Okay? but they never asked for permission. But in order to publish the photo of the Temple of Saturn, you need to ask the Italian government, or in this case the ministry, to get, permission. How come? Imagine these days we got data, personal data, so I can be basically in a book and basically without my permission, but for a monument, we need to go through a bureaucratic stage. So think carefully about this. I want to make you think a little bit. So we go to the ultimate point, because I said we mentioned the word nation. And I said, but what's a nation? So I'll read it out because people online may not see it. Well, I like this definition. There are hundreds of definitions. These are encyclopedias, not online encyclopedias, the Encyclopedia of the Nation, which is a massive work, by hundreds of scholars. Just to put it into perspective, you've got economic nationalism, you've got all sorts of different interpretations, okay? But to cut a long story short, a group of people united by a mistaken view about the past and a hatred of their neighbors. That was brilliant. I think it was the most beautiful definition I've ever seen of nation. It sums it all. If you look at newspapers of any kind, it's us versus them. Whether you put a German flag or the Italian flag, the British flag, doesn't matter. This happens everywhere in the world these days. Okay, very few exceptions. So you got the natural enemy. Why is it natural? Oh, hang on a second. But the word nation and nature are exactly come from the same place. From nascor in Latin, to be born. And so what? Yes, you see, it's the blood issue. We turn it the other way around. It's always the blood issue. Blood, 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 blood. No brain. So we think, even worse than animals. Animals are better than us, I think. We think everything is to do with blood. So nation, nascor. So we assume that we are born in this thing, and we belong to this. So the sense of belonging. Okay, so I want to make you think a little bit, not too much. So we can move on a little bit with the sense of nation. And let's go to the margins. Now, I don't know if you actually see very well. You can see more or less Italy. So I didn't mention Ticino here in my study. Ticino is a canton of Switzerland, 26 cantons in Switzerland. And it's the only canton which is entirely, which actually has Italian as the official language, only language, okay, so to speak. But also Italian is used at the federal level in Switzerland, so it's one of the three official languages. There are 4 national languages in Switzerland, 3 are official, 1 Romansh is considered as national. Okay, but to cut a long story short, I never included Ticino because my study wasn't about the Italian language, A, and B, it was to do with the fragility and the vitality of the margins, so to speak. And Ticino is a very strong, region as a canton. It's a state, by the way, it's a republic, okay? The official name is Repubblica e Cantone Ticino. So it's not just a, like the 9 English, regions, so to speak, So it's its own laws and so forth. Of course, part of Switzerland is considered Willensnations, basically a nation by will rather than being imposed like Italy, for example, okay, or Croatia, or you name any other countries. Okay, now, having said that, so the Grisons are an interesting area. So we go clockwise. The Grisons is where you got, for example, St. Moritz these days. Okay, so it's a canton which has 3 official languages. In fact, there's more complex than that. But there are 4 valleys, okay, where the main characteristic is that official language is Italian. Whether then Italian is actually used in everyday situation is a different story, because the lingua franca is Italian, but people usually communicate in the local vernaculars, and they're very different, okay? So they're Romance vernaculars, but that's not the only thing. And you will see in a minute what sort of other characteristics, if you want, they share with Italy, so to speak. Yet, they're Swiss, okay? And, but the other regions, you can see, are in the Adriatic, and they share more or less a common history, unlike this one. So what differentiates the Italian Grisons from the other 3 areas is that the Italian Grisons, in its history, has never been part of a state called Italy. And for very good reasons. They got rid of their princes in the 15th century. The princes became the communes, basically. Not communes in the sense of communism, okay, in the sense of municipalities, okay? They became very powerful, and they retained this cellular kind of nationhood around the villages, okay, which in England is just unheard of. Means that they have a lot of power locally, which we haven't got here. Okay, and that's why people are very attached to their valleys and particularly the villages. Okay, this is not the case of the other regions. So let's move on to look at the others. So, in a nutshell, have you been to Lake Como, for example? So to the north of that, you've got slightly to the west, and you've got to the east. These three regions. So there are 4 valleys, about 3 regions overall. As you can see, they are not. They are more or less surrounded by other parts of Switzerland or Italy, as you can see. Okay. Now, to the south of this, you've got the Lake Como area and the Valtelline. The Valtelline, for 300 years, was a bailiwick. A bailiwick is an area which is basically subject to another state. Okay, and the other state was the Republic of the Three Leagues, which was now is part of Switzerland, but until 1803, it was a loose, group of states. I had to actually simplify this very much, okay? But there was no central government, so to speak. Are you with me, okay? And these people, basically, for 300 years, kept the most important valley in the Alps for the movement of troops, of Spanish troops. What I mean by Spanish is not today's Spain, it's the Habsburg, okay? And during the 30 Years' War, this area, which was affected a lot by the Reformation as well, was at the center of a lot of political activities. France, Richelieu, you got Spain, so the great powers, and the Grisons as well. You got Milan, which is under Spain, and Venice as well. It was very important, A, for moving people, B, because you need to also move the goods from south to north. Imagine the goods arrive in Venice, and they actually, for example, spices, and they move to the rest of Europe. Well, that was the reason why these people make money, because they had the mountain passes. Are you with me? So why would you surrender your freedom, where you can live off very well by more or less milking, by making money through trade, because everybody had to use your passes. And that's the reason why, you understand why, there is no need to say, well, when Italy was formed in 1861, why would you join a state which more or less tells you what to do when you can be free to do whatever you want to do? But not in the freedom advocated by Brexiteers. That's complete nonsense. This is a real thing, because the money stays literally locally. And this is make difference. You have a project here, you had to central government tell you what to do. Here, if you had to build a dam or something like that, the local population has to approve it. There's no way you can impose on them. But in England, you can. So here we actually have a myth of freedom. There, they know what it means. That's the reality. And there is no prince, there's no centralized form of state, or there's no worshipping of kings or princes. So you need to put it into perspective. And also, freedom, religious freedom a lot. In a place like Poschiavo, one of these valleys, not only did actually share the churches, Protestants and Catholics, of course, for hundreds of years, they more or less ignore one another. But the point I'm trying to make is that they've managed to have a peculiar approach also to Catholicism as well. So in other words, to this day, priests, imagine here in Nottingham, are appointed by the bishop there. They had to be approved by the local parish, the people of the parish. And a lot of priests have been sacked. So that to show it into perspective what freedom is all about. Okay, so because we are here next to the church, so we know what we're talking about. Imagine this, telling a bishop, no, you can't.
Keep your voice down.
Exactly. No, sorry. Okay. So the point, and to make, yes, the bishop could exist, a massive, in the past it was a very important, bishop, but stripped of their worldly goods, because the communists took over everything, and then this is the interesting thing. Now, I'm mentioning this because obviously there are a lot of other stories I deal with. In the book I deal about, smuggling ideas, and books which were basically banned in what is now Italy were printed in the Grisons, including my book, which is actually it's not actually at that level. But the point is why? Because you got religious freedom, and that's important. So, for example, Goethe's first Italian edition of the Sorrows of Young Werther was actually published in Poschiavo, where I published my book. Okay, why was it banned? It was banned because of the theme of suicide. But they could print it there. That's freedom. Are you with me? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Unlike what I mentioned earlier on, Brexiteers talk about freedom and they have no idea what they're talking about because one person is this, the other person is that. Here we are talking about proper freedom. If you want to publish a book, you don't need to ask for permission, basically. Okay, so you can do it. Yeah, and then you can smuggle and make money. That's a good thing. Okay, so that's exactly why the region is still wealthy. Okay, so you can retain that wealth. So now, this is going back to us about the Italian character of the Italian Grisons culture. So sorry.
So if they retain the wealth as an individual group, who builds the infrastructure and maintains it?
Yeah, that's a good point, because you got different types of taxes. You got the municipal, and you got the cantonal and the federal tax. But now there's a tendency towards centralization, I had to say more. But because you pay taxes locally, okay, so if you got a big company staying there, they actually contribute a lot. Right. So if you got a power station, for example, like I know the case of Poschiavo with, Repower, which sponsored my book, by the way. And so you can actually control that money and you can actually invest. But for the large infrastructures, you more or less, because of the nature of the association of the cantons, then you got the redistribution of the money from the richer to the poorer. But this is interesting because it enables them to be closer, the cantons, despite the differences. So in fact, because of the differences, they're closer. And why they're closer? Because they're free to actually decide their destinies. So they know that they share the same value, and therefore they support one another. The solidarity works. In other countries, it doesn't work. Think Belgium, it doesn't work because we retain the money. We don't want to know about you from Flemish to Wallonia. Okay, that's a good example of that. Here, it works because they know that their Swissness is all about, this sense of freedom or being able to retain their money, to retain the way of living, and because they are successful, they don't want to change that. Would you change a successful thing? No. Have I answered your question a little bit? Okay. That's more or less the way it works. Now, this is another interesting thing here because we get to the bottom now. Now, this is an interview made with Dario Monigatti, who is a politician and a teacher. At the time he was retired. I'm not sure whether Dario is following us now. From Brusi in Valposchiavo, which is on the border with Italy. Okay. So, we are born with the Italian language, and without wanting to say, we also, and he smiled, hesitates here, half Italian. I always say that we Grisons Italians, so Grigioni Italiani, have two hearts. One heart that is Italian and another that is German. Now, German doesn't mean German from Germany in Switzerland. The word Tedesco means Swiss German. Germanico means from Germany. So so there's a difference in language, okay? So before you misunderstand this. Why this duality? Because as far as language, culture, food, holidays, and traditions are concerned, I would say that the heart beats for Italy, whereas for work, social security and bureaucracy, imagine bureaucracy, Italian bureaucracy, okay? I would also say that there is a heart that beats for the Swiss-German part. I attach Swiss to make you, okay? The Swiss-German side is our daily bread and butter. Italy on the one hand and Switzerland on the other. First, Romansh speak in Switzerland, so, there are 5 varieties, so to speak, of Romansh. In fact, there's 5 different vernaculars, and then since 1938, there's now a coinage called Romansh Grishun, which was created at the time when Italy was under pressure from fascism in Italy, okay? So, but anyway, Romansh speaking Switzerland is, all around in the Grisons, basically. The Grisons has officially 3 languages, but in fact it's more complex than that. Okay, anyway, that neighbouring Engadine, where Samoritz is, where the British actually, more or less founded winter sports, winter skiing and so forth. And then the Swiss-German Switzerland. Okay, so in a nutshell, you can say straight away, it's not that, we don't want to be Italian. Simply, hang on a second, we speak the language, but we're very happy to be Swiss. Okay, are you with me? Okay, so this is the interesting thing. You need to bear in mind that you don't want to actually surrender your wealth and your great life. You've got living standards. Why would you actually go for the poorer part? Just for the sake of waving a flag, would you? No, nobody would do it. Now, you know, it's difficult to actually sum up in a few things because I did a lot of research about the literary texts, which has to do with the borders, the smuggling of ideas, the different religious perspectives, okay, faith Protestantism and Catholicism, okay, living side by side, but also there are differences. Now, you saw the image here. Can you see this image before we move on any further? What can you see is an ibex. You saw it at the beginning. Can you see it? So you see an ibex here. Okay, now this is not about, Photoshop. The only Photoshop thing, and I put the C behind, I said, why? Because it's about mountain and sea cultures. Mountain cultures in the case of the Grisons, and sea cultures were the next bit, which is from Trieste southwards, okay? But the interesting thing about this ibex, and you see on the back, there is a damaged lion, Venetian lion. More about that in a minute. Okay, it's the fact that the ibex, you can see, has peculiar colors. I didn't do this, so I took a photo by a place which still exists. Should you go to Valbregaglia, which is divided in two by Italy and Switzerland, as soon as you cross the border, which is a pedestrian border now, okay, so I'll show you the pictures in the book as the border crossing was changed, at least the pedestrian ones, in 2014. So 2014 was changed dramatically. Anyway, they actually, in 2003, each municipality in the Grisons received a statue, basically, of the ibex. The ibex being the symbol. You see symbols. We use symbols all the time, of the Grisons. And it's a symbol of freedom, because the ibex has no borders. The interesting thing is the ibex became extinct in the Grisons and were reintroduced by smuggling them from Italy. From the royal, what is it, from this royal park, I forgot now the name, I think it's in the Gran Paradiso area, okay, so which was a royal reserve, I think, okay, so from there, they were smuggled back into the Grisons. And the word Stambecco, ibex, and the Grisons means somebody, you know, who's exactly a true Grisons person. So that to show you how the symbol goes beyond beyond the, as I say, calling somebody, I suppose, a thistle, and you say, what? Okay, or call him, whatever you want to call him, because of their symbol. Anyway, the other thing, you notice the colors. The children of the Italian Valbregaglia and the Swiss Valbregaglia decided to paint it with the colors of the former municipality of Castagna, chestnut, okay, which still hosts the largest chestnut grove in Europe, okay, which is very popular among Swiss Germans, by the way. It's right on the border. This valley is famous for Giacometti, you know, the artist. One of the most beautiful valleys in the Alps, in fact. And it's very connected to England because of John Florio. John Florio was possibly the most important humanist of Shakespeare. Some people thought he was the real Shakespeare, in fact. And John Florio lived 10 years in this area before he came back to England with his father, who was sorry to say this, a fornicator. And he had a lot of problems, you know, they were Protestants, okay, originally from Lucca, and they came to England, and they went to Bregaglia. They did a lot of preaching there. John Florio taught 10 years, or lived 10 years there, and they came back to England, and he became one of the most important scholars. So he wrote a fantastic book, which is called A World of Words. He introduced a lot of words to English language, by the way. So if you keep John Florio, massive connection to this area, okay, just in case you're interested. And you've got the Salis family, also connected with, you know, they're part of the British aristocracy. They've been part of British aristocracy since the 18th century. Now, I'm sorry for jumping to the next bit. When you say, what has it got to do with the other regions? Now, there is a center of connection between these areas historically, because you may have heard of the town of Trieste, or the city of Trieste, okay? And Trieste, most people associate Trieste with the Habsburgs. It's true. They've been part of the Habsburg. They were part of the Habsburg. The word empire is a big word, because obviously it originally wasn't. But they were part of this world, which then became known as the Austrian and the, you know, and then Austria-Hungary and so forth, since 1382, if I remember well. But you may associate Trieste these days with coffee, don't you? Coffee, Italy, and so forth. And most people think, oh, coffee came from Vienna. No, it didn't. It came from Venice. But I think it was in 1767, the Venetians decided to expel the Protestants. And most of them were running patisseries in Venice, and they were from the Grisons. Ah, that's the connection. And they've been living in Venice for hundreds of years, okay, either as mercenaries or running patisseries. The Swiss patisseries in southern England, they're still famous, they all more or less came from this area. Okay, so just to put into perspective. Now, they moved to Trieste. What has it got to do with this? Now, they moved to Trieste. They still have, one of the oldest church in Trieste still bears the name. Androna dei Grigioni is a street called that way. In fact, the Protestants, again, but they actually start running the patisseries and the coffee shops in Trieste as well. So, and then the architecture of Trieste is, oh yes, Central Europe. No, they're Swiss architects, I'm afraid, mostly. Okay, there's a big connection. But Trieste is not the center of my study, so marginally, I'm not a specialist in that area. So, south of Trieste, though, is an area which, for different reasons, historically, we go back to the Romans, even before that, you got, what we call the Greeks, and even the Greeks are not what we mean, because there were no such thing as the Greek nation, although modern Greeks say the same thing, like the Italians, they existed, okay? They weren't. Anyway, so there were cities on the coast, many on the coast, which then were influenced heavily by the Romans, eventually. Now, when you got these Slavic invasions, there are a lot of debates whether the Slavs arrived at certain centuries or not. This is not the issue here. But in any case, the cities and the surrounding areas were more or less separate worlds. And this lasted for thousands of years, more or less. Of course, there were a lot of exchanges, in the sense, people from the city were, the toffs, if you want, so the posh people, okay? So, the others were the hoi polloi. But there were differences also in the way they approach, food cultures, okay? So you got what is now, for example, the so-called Croatians, Croats. If you look at their food, it's mainly influenced by lamb, so it's quite fatty food. But the ones from the cities were slightly more refined, as you well know, because people from the city, had the advantage of having trade. So, anyway, just to put it into perspective. Anyway, for hundreds of years, you got this peculiar reality. But what a lot of people confuse is this. Yes, they were under Venice. It's true, they were under Venice for hundreds of years. But by the way, one of the problems with thinking under Venice is you use the word empire, and it's wrong. There was no emperor. Venice was a republic. And it was even more, I'm sorry to say this, more democratic than England is in many ways, because there are at least 1,000 families, more or less, running the business. Out of a population of 100,000. So imagine the proportion here is like having, 1 million people or 2 million people in power. Okay? So anyway, I don't want to actually digress too much. But in any case, looking at those areas, if we go down from Trieste, just south of Trieste, we found Istria. Now, this area is interesting to these days, because have you been to Croatia on holiday at all? Have you been to this area?
Yeah.
You may have noticed the architecture, and the first thing that strikes is the architecture. And more or less, wherever you go, you'll find Venetian lions. Okay, so if you went to Venice, you see lots of churches that they use the stone is from Istria, pietra istriana. So, of course, within Croatian national narratives, they say, oh yes, the Venetian stripes, oh land there, they actually use our resources. This is typical nationalism, So this got this rhetoric from all sides, the national rhetoric. And today what we do is we put flags on top of these places, bearing in mind that these nation states didn't exist for hundreds of years. Okay? So this is one of the problems. We go to Croatia and it's a mixture of architectures. Stop. Ignorance, total ignorance. It's not a mixture of architecture. We have hundreds of years of different strata, if you want. It's not the way, it's a mixture. It's not that you put in everything in one pot in architecture. Okay, otherwise everything collapses, I suppose. Imagine putting this item here, an item there, and you don't measure, the building. And you hear still people, they obsess Italianate architecture. Can you just stop labeling things? For the sake of being correct and precise, don't do this silly thing. So, yes, the Venetian character is very strong. It's very strong in the language. Whether you are in Istria, you're down to Montenegro, the influence of the Venetian language, and in part also Italian, is very strong in today as language as well. So when you went to Montenegro, in the small town of Cattaro, Kotor, which we'll get at later on, the language there is so incomprehensible for a lot of people from inland, from Serbia or from other places, because it's so full of words coming from Venetian or Italian, which is basically incomprehensible for people on outside. Okay, so this is the depth. But you've got the cuisines as well. You've got the tradition is not a word, but you think about the carnivals, for example. You got the Venetian carnivals, the same type of carnivals you find them also on the coast, okay, in the same kind of way, okay. So there are a lot of similarities. The food, you went to Venice, we're getting close to Easter, and if you travel to those areas and you find, you think about pancakes here, and you think about chiacchiere, you got crostoli, all these things, and you find crostoli in the area near Venice, and you find crostoli in Montenegro, in these coastal areas, but not inland, to this day, okay? So to put into perspective, that's why I had to start digging. Because if you just stop at language and national flags, you will not get anywhere. And then you got a religious component. So when you look at, my hands are not very nice, but you got 10 fingers usually, okay? Most people stop at the flag and language. Yes, but as Gershwin used to say, you can still use another 8 fingers, okay? So you're going to talk about architecture, you can talk about the food, you can talk so the religious items. So there's so many complexities, and yes, we're never able to define what culture means. We just say, oh, it's culture. What do you mean by culture? Well, it's culture. It's like, Fiddle on the Roof, traditions. I don't know where the tradition comes from. Now, going back to us, the difference between the Grisons here is that here, and we just scroll down in Slovenia and Croatia, the Italians call themselves Italians, in fact. They call the Italian national community. Wow. Now, I don't want to actually drive you crazy because it's a long story, but when nationalism basically started exploding, and that was in 1848, okay, we had to bear in mind that was the most important year for this. Not that there wasn't anything before, but it's with the French Revolution, the concept of modernism, that brought the ideas of language, or similarities, and the idea of the nation. That was more or less then. But it was in 1848, during the Revolution, that people started more or less, including within the same families, to take sides. Croats versus Italians, within the same families. And they started fighting, okay? The irony is that the Austrians, who actually brought education for everybody, started dividing people into groups according to language. And that was called nation, by the way. So nationality, in those days, in the 1860s, for example, didn't mean passports. As you know, passports are a very modern invention, contrary to what people think. Okay? No, they existed as a piece of paper to go through one port to the next. But they didn't exist as much as to mean that you're a citizen of one place. Are you with me? Not what we think now when we think about nationality. Okay, so it wasn't. We need to bear in mind. We have to be careful not to apply contemporary mindsets to periods where these things did not exist. Now, sorry if I'm jumping from one thing to the next, but it's important to understand that we got this fragmentation, and you divide people, and you put them into schools which are divided, then you look for trouble. Sooner or later, okay? But it was science at the time, because science developed a lot in those areas, started dividing people into boxes. So you are this linguistic group, because linguistics was born at the end of the 18th century, and in the 19th century, historical linguistics defined the maps of Europe. It wasn't before that, okay? Before that, it was religious differences. Okay? Today, we think less about religious differences, but with the way we behave, like including the way we weigh hands and so forth, we control ourselves, it has got to do with religious education, okay? Which was the only form of education available before that, okay? You need to bear in mind. So now we discover the language differences and they create these ideas. Now, before we get to this, a quick thing about the story here. Now, 1848 revolutions. Now we go to Italy, which now becomes a nation state. We got 1861. There was 1866. Venice is then, of course, we got different wars. Eventually, the Veneto area is become part of Italy. Trieste isn't, okay? And Aquileia isn't either. Aquileia is an important place. I don't know if you've ever been there. Aquileia influenced the architecture of all, basically, the bell towers in the Eastern Adriatic. And Venice was also Venice's grandmother. Sorry. Aquileia was Venice's grandmother, okay? So we need to bear in mind, today, Aquileia is a small place. Amazing to see, but it's a tiny little place. So, Aquileia is not far away from Trieste. Okay. However, that area stayed under Austria. We got the war. Italy entered the war for one specific purpose: to conquer territory, to conquer what they call terre irredente, the land which should be returned to us. This is the principle. So a group of nutters persuaded basically the government to actually intervene. The result, we know it, is that South Tyrol then became also part of Trentino as well, and Trieste was conquered, so at the end of the First World War. And that created more tensions. And the tensions is that Trieste was a city. Have you heard of Prosecco wine? Okay, Prosecco is part of Trieste. Prosecco is Prosec. I did research about this. Prosec, okay, and it was a Slovenian-speaking part of Trieste. It doesn't mean it was actually Slovenia, okay, because Slovenia didn't exist as a concept, but it's part of Trieste anyway. Now, the entire coast there, people spoke different languages. And Trieste these days, I think a third of the population, if I'm not wrong, is still Slovenian-speaking. Okay, so we need to bear in mind. So when we look at this, so 1919, Trieste becomes more or less, at the end of the war, Italian. Then you got fascism. With fascism, you got repression of the minorities, destruction of monuments, destruction of schools, books, and everything. You name it. You create more tensions. Here comes the Second World War. Sorry if I'm going quickly, but to show you. And in those areas which are now part of Slovenia and Croatia, before we get to Montenegro, more tensions arrived. Fascism did a lot of disasters, as you would expect. Okay, they started more repressing the Slavs, the evil Slavs, which you consider inferior people. You need to bear in mind that the word slave in English comes from the Venetian, okay, but because Slavos didn't exist in Latin, and it means the Slavonic people from Sclavonia, okay? So, servants. In fact, Scavo in those areas, in the vernaculars, means both people from the former Yugoslavia, so to speak, or even Russian, so forth, if you want, and also means servant, okay? So the English word slave comes from that, by the way. Sorry if I'm jumping a little bit, or make you think a little bit. The relationship of, if you want, of what people consider themselves as the descendants of the Romans, there was this arrogance, or the fascist, we bring civilization, these are the peasants, in other words. And the peasants mainly, so to speak, lived in the countryside, but it was actually black and white, because I did a lot of interesting, a book by Roberta Durbath, who's a writer. She's younger than me. She's published a lot about this, published stories which are set in different parts of the 20th and 21st century about real people who didn't actually know what identity meant, a national identity. They spoke different languages. So we need to bear in mind this thing. Anyway, so here comes fascism, repression. After the Second World War, there's a lot of Britain here, by the way. In 1947, Italy, lost the war. And Italy lost the territories which, were once upon a time Venetian territory, and then they became Italian territory between the two wars. The problem is, in 1947, there was a treaty of, this is the dodgy part here. There was a treaty on the 10th of February in Paris. It was signed, and more or less the borders started to be established. And what happens is you start moving people who don't belong in those categories, don't you? Now, I'm actually simplifying this. Okay, it's more complex than this. Now, another thing is when you're actually in a country, they ask you an option. You want to be either a citizen of this country or you go. And they say they call the options, the opzioni, a Yugoslav citizen or an Italian. So if you want to be Yugoslav, you stay here, you give up your Italianness, if you wanted to speak, and you stay here. And most people left. Okay? 1954, Memorandum of London, this is in October 1954, more or less that was the end of it, the whole thing. So there was 7 years, massive exodus of people, and those left behind are at the center of my study. And the descendants. Now, we are going about from a majority to a tiny minority in a space of 7 years. Villages, cities, towns are emptied. You had to bring in people from other places to till the land and so forth. The people who left didn't necessarily, some people left because of national identity issues, but the people who stayed behind, it's not that, we want to become communist. Those people who want to become communists, but there were people who said, we don't want to leave our cattle behind. So simplifying things, yes, because they wanted to be Italian and Yugoslav. I'm afraid to say this is the stupidity of the way we think a lot. All of us, I have to say. No, I don't say you're stupid. But we think in national categories. We don't understand that the reasons why people do not leave their properties is often has little to do with identity, and it's often to do with what are we going to do with the cattle here. Some of you may live in the countryside. You have cattle. You are attached to that kind of thing, and it's understandable. Okay. So among the people who left, you may have heard of Mario Andretti, Formula One world champion. Well, he came from a well-off family from Montona, Motoville these days in Istria. They left everything behind. Okay, he was offered recently to actually repurchase his own house. He said it was too complicated. Would you repurchase your house even if you're a millionaire after it was actually taken away from you? Okay, so there are a lot of issues still unresolved, but I don't want to go through those things. Anyway, what is left became more stronger and stronger, and they developed this sense of, let me call it, identity. And they created the Italian national communities we still exist today, which are the most active communities there. So if you went to see, shipbuilding, in the summer, if you went to see some concerts with peculiar languages, with peculiar songs and so forth, it's because of these communities still exist. Okay? Does that make any sense a little bit? And there are about 50 of them. So some of them are also in mainland Croatia, but it's a slightly more complex situation. I don't want to go through that. Mainly they're here, you can see, between Slovenia, this is Italy at the top, and this is Slovenia, and this is Croatia, this is actually Istria. And then you got a couple of them in Dalmatia, okay, in places like Split or Split. You got Zara or Zadar, okay, and I go through a lot of them these days, okay. So I just travel a lot, spent in total over 9 years, 8 months in different places, interviewing people, gathering material, okay. But the left hand did the historical bit, and the right hand on the piano basically did the contemporary stuff. So this is why it worked, because just writing about history, there are millions of books anyway.
What kind of numbers of people are we talking?
So, in total, good question. Difficult to define, but we're talking about overall, possibly between the two countries, Slovenia and Croatia, about 30,000, 35,000. But because in one country you can no longer divide people according to census in Slovenia, okay, it's extremely difficult to, because one of the books I deal with, for example, when they asked in an interview, we talk about Roberta Dubatz's Chiesa di Nessuno, there was a story about this guy, and they asked this person to reveal the national identity, they write Renault, like the car. So this is an interesting example to say, excuse my French, sod off. Why do you want to put national identity on me? To stick it upon me like it were as a badge. Okay, so this is the problem with a lot of historians. When they research, they keep using the word identity, they stick it on people, and they label. Be careful. A lot of people don't want to be classified this way. Why? Okay, some people do love it, but some people don't want to, because they say, well, I speak different languages, and so what? It's you who are silly, you only speak one language. This is more or less their attitude. So anyway, there are some bigger communities and smaller communities, more active communities and less active communities. But they have, for example, schools. There are state schools within the Slovenian or Croatian system, but the language used for teaching is Italian, so they're taught in Italian, a specific, this is not like Italian migrants, are you with me? So it's within the state system, but they have a peculiar school system within it, okay? So from nursery basically up to when, school leavers. Universities is a different thing. A lot of people tend to go to the Este when they want to continue, or they go to other parts of Croatia or Slovenia. But I don't want to drive you crazy, because we may take a break in a minute, and for people online, we need to, because otherwise people will go mad here. And we actually go and delve into the realities of these communities these days, okay? Now, one of the big issues, before we take a break, is that the ones who were left behind are called rimasti, although I had to say rimasti now is 1947 to 2024. You can realize the label stay behind doesn't really work anymore, okay? But it's one of those labels, then you just they're used because they're helpful. And then you got the ones who left, who went to America, to Italy, Trieste in particular, and everywhere. And until 2012, there was so much tension between the same families, because the ones who stayed behind were considered as not proper Italians. Okay? So same families divided. Some left, and I know by this because I interview people, they didn't want to be told to speak another language. The ones who stay behind say it's not a big issue for us. Okay, so within the same families, you got massive divisions. Okay, and until 2012, basically there was very little, happening. And then the first meeting occurred; it was actually more smoother. You even have the mayors, if you want, in exile from these cities and towns. Are you with me? So this is exactly the kind of thing. So some of them went and they founded a town in Sardinia as well. I think it's called Fertilia, and so where all the Istrians live there. In Rome, they got a specific area, Quartiere Giuliano Dalmata, so they live, in this kind of community. Well, at least they lived until recently. I can't speak for, the most recent years. So, more or less, their will stopped, according to one person I interviewed, in 1947. A bit like some people in this country still think that it's April 1945. Sorry to say that. Are you with me? But it's a very similar mindset when you think, the old days. And they still think, oh, okay. And in this beautiful, I have to say, this 14 stories, it's called Chiesa di Nessuno, which is also, I would love to actually see as a film, to be honest. One of the stories is about this lady who decided to go from Florence back to her ancestors' home in Istria to make it more Italian. But she ends up in a house where she meets refugees from what is now Montenegro, who actually took over the house. The evil Slavs, as the grandmother of this woman, Laura, used to say to her. And Laura, who goes there to change a little bit Istria with her Italianness, understands that she has to learn Croatian to speak to this other lady and this family. Okay, so there's a big connection. It's like, oh, it's nice fairy tale, but it's actually a true story, by the way. Okay, but it's obviously told in a very interesting way. So it's very capturing. A short story which was actually caught my attention is not the only one, because it was printed. It was actually published in 2012. So we're not talking about hundreds of years ago. And it's interesting because it gives you an insight of these areas. And when you go there and you start labeling people, flags, country, language, and you don't understand exactly the situation, is much more complex than that and more interesting. And you start saying, oh, the food is a mixture. What does it mean? Nothing. All food is a mixture. Okay? We take spices from all over the world. So, and you say it's proper British when you take, ingredients from Singapore or from Saudi Arabia, anywhere else. Are you with me? So there is a risk of again, using the national labels and not understanding that we have to be careful with this. So before we take the break, and then we move on and dig into this, you need to bear in mind that the situation today is that of the Italian communities are divided between two countries. Now, the one in Montenegro is a slightly separate thing, but we'll actually look at some very interesting examples about heritage. And one of the biggest issues affecting these communities is that they often think that their own cultures are either under threat or dying for different reasons. And this is why, I suppose there's a lot of fragility, which I mentioned in the title of my book. At the same time, they're even more active than any communities you may find in Italy in terms of production. So they have, for example, a lot of them have mandolin courses that insist on that. So there's huge, massive, work on having these courses. Or you got theatre, massive theatre. For example, in Italy, theatre is more or less absent in school. Here, massive effort to do, work on theatre. And it involves all people from young and old, which is something you may not find in other places. So there's as somebody told me, when you come close to borders or to areas where you got these minorities, there is an even stronger need to producing sense of culture, in inverted commas. So theatre, books, are you with me? A lot of people study history there, unsurprisingly, okay? So that's interesting if you, provided you go there to see these places and you remove what in Italian people say I salami dagli occhi. So you need to remove basically your blinkers with labels. Are you with me? Croatian, Italian, are you with me? If you go there with the tanks, like in the war, you end up exactly what the British did. And I want to tell you about the next story after the break about a school which should have not existed. Asterix. I called it the village of Asterix on radio. I studied that phenomenon for 5 years. And I'll tell you after the break if you don't mind. Shall we take a break?
Take a break.
Okay. Sorry about Stay online, state online perché torniamo fra una decina di minuti. Okay? Penso che dopo mezz'ora finisco. No, non ce la fate più.
No, è un po'...
Freddo? No, no, grazie, non bevo niente. Avrei dovuto farlo in mezz'ora, ma non ho chiesto di allungare. No, grazie.
What's the name of the Florence woman who wrote the short story?
No, ti mando dopo il testo. È Roberta Dubaz, l'autrice.
Roberta?
Dubaz. Te lo mando dopo, te lo dico dopo.
Oh, I see, okay. My apologies, I thought it started at 11.
Tranquilla.
I have to go now. So
Nessun problema.
thank you very much.
Grazie.
See you on Monday.
Ci vediamo lunedì, grazie. Qui, Nicola? Qua. Yes.
My mother-in-law on TV. You know, I don't like the truth. You know, I'm under Alan's Italian job. They're in the bar and they go to Forno Velasco. They buy this house for €1 and they do it up. Yeah, but episode 6, my mother-in-law's teaching Alan Carl to paint, and it takes him to my mother-in-law's house and in his garden and everything. And at the end of the project, it's only a half-an-hour programme. Just mention.
There's always been a divide between north and south, east and west, like in terms of affluence. It seems like the south has always been poor, the north has always been rich. I can understand it's like the gateway to Europe.
In what areas?
In Italy.
I'm the wrong person for this, I'm afraid. You need an economic expert in Italy. I don't think I will be able to answer that question.
I just thought, I know it's kind of more...
No, I need somebody who knows about, the economy and so forth, and also an Italian expert. I'm not. It's not my area.
Your children in Italian, do you?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Well, I teach Italian here at the university. So they also speak German in the house. So
Fantastic. My grandchildren.
just answer to people online. No, that's fine.
Teaches Alan Carl, can't stand. It's on Friday night, 8:30, for half an hour. If you've got iPlayer, you can watch it. Yeah, and there's a party at the end.
Is it already on iPlayer?
Yeah, because we watched it. Yeah, we watched it because we put it well, we showed the sister-in-law a message, but it never really said that. And my son said, "Oh, we were there with the film." I said, "You never told us this."
Oh,
So
God, but it's on iPlayer already.
Yeah, they're going to India for 3 months, so I reckon that's what the fee is probably paid for that.
Oh, gosh.
Apologize for talking so much. I wanted to say I usually do it in 35 minutes, but I was asked to do the break in the middle, so
Yeah.
to talk for about an hour and a half. I'll try to
Because
finish
we've
it.
got to leave at
I
once.
apologize.
Yeah,
Well,
cheers.
I think
Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
Nulla? Chiedi. Perdón, lo lascio. Sì. Prendilo.
No, I
Te lo lascio, prendilo. Te lo lascio.
Il libro?
Sì, prendilo.
Andoro, per me.
Sì, per te.
Grazie.
Prego. Ci sono un po' di errori dentro, ma...
Gabriele,
Comunque, Roberta Dubas, lo trovi dentro, è il libro, è un libro, no, questo è un altro libro molto difficile, sono 50 pagine di libro, ma molto difficile da leggere.
But I did much yesterday because my father brought me.
Questo è un libro bellissimo.
Ah, okay. That's fantastic.
Questa storia di queste diverse persone, diversi personaggi.
What's interesting to me is because I've just been reading Bloom in Trieste, by
yeah.
But I wanted to two things about the book. I've just finished reading it because of my little pilgrimage to Trieste in May.
You went to Trieste last year?
You went this May, yeah.
Oh, this May you're
just
going,
do a James Joyce study.
Yeah.
Anyway, in Ulysses, this line, "What is a nation?" is there. In
Because it
fact,
was
in
the
the
first one
chapter,
to actually come up was a couple of years. It was Ernest Renan in 1882 who
Yeah.
wrote an essay about this.
Yeah,
You can find it
right.
online. It's a very
Yeah.
short essay.
But anyway, let me just tell you about Joyce, put that in. In the chapter called The Citizen in Ulysses, they are, because he's Jewish, I don't know how, they're getting at it. They say, and he answers, a nation, that put it to him, what is a nation? He said it's a place where all the people are the same in one place. And it's really a strange answer to the question. But I would like you to look at it though as well. But one second thing to tell you about the writer of that book on Bloom has just recently been made il rettore dell'Università
Macerata.
di Macerata.
Ah, so chi è, so chi è. Sì, sì. No, ci scriviamo su LinkedIn.
Sì, and he's the first
Sì, sì, John
person-
McCord.
Yes, John McCord, and he's Irlandese.
Sì, sì, sì.
Yes, and he's the first non-Italian
Sì, sì.
holder of that
John
position
McCord, sì, sì.
in the
È famoso.
Ateneo di Italia.
Yeah, interesting
And
about
so-
Trieste is
but he's very good on the book, strong on the irredentists, because they were really strong.
Oh, of course, yeah, yeah. And he, in fact, this story was that when Joyce, he was teaching there, then he went to Pola, which
Yeah,
in
in Pola,
1947
yes, where he started
became
off.
Pula
Yeah,
in 1947.
yeah.
He was actually, he said he was like Siberia.
And, yes.
Speaking of which, one or two people complaining about the cold.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I know, but it doesn't make a difference. There's no heating here.
No, so I do apologise for that.
So is it not part of the rent?
So, we have to be out by 1.
Oh no, I finish. What time is it now?
It is.
Oh, cranky. So we have to start in 5 minutes and I'll finish off.
Okay.
All right, well, I'll sit down.
All right.
Get everybody back in.
We needed that.
It's okay. It's so my marito gone to
Scappato via.
No, in 20 minuti chiudiamo. We'll finish in 20 minutes.
I'm going to be speedy. It's so cold. Are you not cold? No. You're lucky.
No, my hands are cold, but that's a different problem.
Yeah.
But I'm not cold as
Cold
in.
in the room.
Yeah,
He's
it's.
had a bit of a chest infection. Same here.
I've got every layer on it makes no difference. No, I'm more than my body.
So is everybody back with their coffee so we can move on and finish in 18 to 20 minutes? Shall I start again? Do you mind? Okay, so to more or less finish off what we did today, one of the issues I mentioned earlier on and several times is that we take the past and we like to stick labels on. And the problem is whether you call it Italian, Croatian, Slovenian, British, you name it, whatever you want, we have a problem with that. And when I interviewed this lawyer who died a few years ago, he was one of the few aristocrats who didn't leave after communism arrived, and that was in the city of Spalato or Split in Croatian, and we're discussing the problem of the past, because in these areas, and you can see from the jacket here of the book, can you see this lion has been damaged? Now, a lot of lions, in Dalmatia in particular, were demolished because they were seen as a symbol of fascism. Now, can you imagine that? Now, the Venetian lion and fascism, there's something missing here. Okay, so a lot of the problems is you take symbols from the past, and because Mussolini himself said, basically Venice was part of Italy, that was the bizarre thing. So anything Venetian basically was, he used stronger words. You're talking about birth, women bearing these fruits. It's unbelievable, the kind of language. Always in that being born in the blood issue, the flesh issue, this is exactly where, because people are attached to this idea of the flesh, of the heart. So the point is, look at this, what Lidl did recently. They created this thing. They said 12 Italian-style British beef meatballs. Okay, so I don't know what it means, but then they put the heart and the flag, and the flag and the heart. So that's to prove the point. The problem is, of course, it sells, but the issue here is, you know, we don't think with the heart. Well, we thought, because we still say to record what we think with the brain. But people are emotions, you stir emotions by talking nonsense, as usual. Now, go back to this. What he said to me is there is a lack of objectivity in the presentation of cases, like talking about the cultural heritage, buildings, lions, you know, being damaged, for example. Why do you damage a lion which was built hundreds of years ago? Because it represents the enemy.
Yeah.
The symbol of the enemy. Now, every single case, I think, must be analysed separately because each situation in itself is independent and cannot be generalised. Okay, generalising these issues about who owns cultural heritage, okay, creates a very, very pleasant situations that lead to distorted interpretations and inaccurate knowledge of cultural life. In other words, you know, you can't say this is Italian or Croatian heritage. Don't label it. It's heritage. It's heritage we've got. These people who died didn't say you should be given this to Italians or the Croats. Okay? And this is one of the problems. So when you got the damaged lion like this, and you're saying, what are you going to do about restoring these things? And again, massive debates. Right. Because it's interference, and journalists write a lot of nonsense, as usual. As you can see, you know, they just more or less stir up emotions, but it's exactly what you don't need. Now, cultural piracy is a problem. You would take things from the past and we label them with their own present-day categories. Nationalism begins. This is an interview I carried out on the beautiful island of Lusin Piccolo, or Mali Lošinj, okay, in Croatia. Now, nationalism begins. This lady was the daughter, well, the heir of one of the most important families. They actually, you know, the shipbuilders in the Adriatic. Her mother decided to stay behind, unlike all the relatives, basically. Okay, so the lady who knows a lot about sea cultures, very, very much. But when I asked her about nationalism, this is what she has to say to me. Nationalism begins. We're talking about the 1990s here. Okay, all Croats must be Croats. Whoever is not a Croat is nothing. The amoebas were Croats, but they were not conscious. The Romans were Croats, but they were not just conscious. One must be conscious of Croatianness. Marco Polo was a Croat. Well, the Italians say the same thing about Marco Polo. Say, why can't you just leave them? We don't know this. They were not certainly Italian. They were not, you know, don't label these people. Yet, we all do it these days. Okay? Everyone was a Croat. Okay? So, this is exactly the point we're reaching, is madness, complete madness. We got to the last part now, and it says, what about Montenegro? No, we saw the communities there, over 50 communities in Slovenia and Croatia very quickly. And now, if I have the time, I go back to the case of the school in Crevatini. Now, this area became interesting because it's completely cut off from the rest of the world. Now, the Venetians arrived here, but the Venetians didn't actually become the owners of this area. For 6 times, the Venetians denied the inhabitants of this area, which is now part of Montenegro, which is labeled in English wrongly as the Bay of Kotor. It isn't a bay. Okay? That's why they used to be called Mouths of Cattaro, or in the local language, Boka Kotorska. Boka comes from Venetian and Italian, means mouth. Okay? It's a complex area where the sea is very deep into the mountains. Okay? So anyway, to cut a long story short, in this area, the Venetians basically arrived after the 7th attempt, basically, by the local people, said we need protection from the Turks and so forth. For hundreds of years they were there, the Venetians, they built a lot, and they created a fantastic jewel, which is today's Kotor. Until 1918 it was called Cattaro. Okay. Anyway, now the interesting thing is a few years ago, they decided the main gate, most people come here by massive ships, so they just get off the ships, they visit the place, take photos, and they see this, you know, gate. And they see the gate with funny things coming up. Now, the gate on the right is the current day gate, and the one on the left is the old gate as it was in those days, until what? In 1940, in 1944, I think it was, Tito arrived and liberated the area, which was then occupied by the Italians. Cattaro became part officially of Italy between 1941 and 43. Anyway, the Nazis and the fascists were there. Okay, so it was liberated. So, and what they did is they replaced two things which were on the gate. So you go through the gate today, you see a, I'll show you in a minute for the next bit. You will see basically a strange thing. Let me just see whether I've got another picture here. Okay, I've got a detail. Can you see there is a star here and the 21st of November 1944. Now, they replaced two things, the Venetian lion, and there was a Latin inscription which says justice is the base, the fundament of the state. That says it all. And what they put instead is this, tu genecemo svoine damo, which means basically what is ours we won't give up, and what is not ours we don't want it. So it's crazy in English, but this is exactly the point. So what is not ours we don't want it, so we get rid of those symbols. What is ours, the gate, is ours. Okay, so what happens is that a few years ago, recently, I was involved with this. I had to interview people from different viewpoints. They decided to restore the door, the gate, but there was a problem. The local Italian community said, we would like to restore, together with this, the lion and the saying about justice. The saying about justice was put by the Austrians in 1814. The descendants, so look at all the so-called partisans, said, no way. So the money came from Italy. They eventually restored the gate, but those two signs were not put into place again. Okay, so today you go through there and you got the image that this gate was actually created by Tito. So, but it's not Italian. This is the whole point. And Italians say, oh, it's ours. No, it's not yours. You know, if the Venetians built it, it's fine. The Venetians built it with the local population. You have to respect things. Unfortunately, we have this idea in the 21st century that, you know, monuments are ours and we do whatever we want with them. Okay? So this is the interesting thing. Now, because we only have a few minutes left here, the story here was that in 1945, you see, they used sledgehammers to break the relief of the Venetian lion I mentioned. So they destroyed the unity of the gate. And the person who, you know, talking about this was an incredible guy who came originally from Sarajevo, but he decided to become a member of the Italian community. In fact, he died a couple of years ago. He was an amazing guy, Jovica Martinovic. He wrote in the local vernacular as well, a newspaper called Carampana. In Venice, Carampana, and in Italian means either prostitute or a dodgy place anyway. Whereas in Carampana, in Kotor, there's a symbol, there's a fountain, a water pump. They never had any water pump where the ladies used to meet. And now from this magazine, they created for decades, without any support, external support, to maintain alive this sense of, well, Italian is crazy in my opinion, but this is why inverted commas, Italian community, so to speak, okay? But it was a local community of people which either were, they called themselves Italians because they were Catholics, in an area where the Catholicism used to be the majority of the population, but then after all the movements in Yugoslavia, it became a minority, okay? They either called themselves Croats, or sometimes Italians. So you see, the labels are not that fixed as you can understand, okay? Anyway, a lot of what they defend here, oops, I got the impression that the, sorry about that. Something funny happened okay. Anyway, so the interesting bit, we only have a few minutes left, is I want to go back a little bit to this. We got 5 minutes, okay. So, in the one in Montenegro is an interesting case because you got historical heritage, and most people who go to Montenegro are going to see these places, like this artificial island built in the shape of a ship, okay, for example. And every year they got a fascinata, which is an ancient tradition, local tradition. Fascinata means bound together. You see the language, right, Venetian, okay, where they actually threw the stones to build the island, okay. So you got the carnivals. They got their own food traditions, and they're very attached to this idea. And by the way, the last, I should say flag, but it's actually it's more than that, was a stendardo of Venice, was buried in Perasto, today Perast, near Cattaro, near Kotor, in 1797, in August. The Venetians surrendered in May 1797, ending, the history of one of the most amazing republics in the history of Europe, the most, in fact, most important. But the people from this area, from Boka Kotorska, Mouths of Cattaro, never gave up until, well, actually didn't give up until August of that year. And they buried this flag underneath the altar of this church, okay? And every year they still go back to remember this. This is the kind of attachment. So you can see it's pretty unusual if you think about this, okay? This is kind of, that's why I said put on a label like Italian is very dangerous, particularly in flag. Are you with me? Because you just twist the story more than the history, the story of the area, because this is attachment to Venice, which is for them extremely important for their own thing. Because their own food is, very influenced, so they're really proud of this at the end of the day. Final thing, we jump a bit back to the case of Crevatini. Sorry if I jump back to the top of the Adriatic. Now, the small village called Crevatini or Crevatini, which is part of Copper Capodistria. From this village, you can see Trieste underneath. Okay, so it's only 800 meters from the border. Now, I mentioned the British earlier on. In 1954, after the events which led to the movement of people basically within this area, move here, move there, the area was not really, in those days, defined as we know, we see today. We got Slovenia and Croatia and so forth. Because the complexity of having different people speaking different languages in those days was a problem for the authorities, not for the local people. So they created different schools, and they created a list of official schools where there were people who had to be taught in Italian or in Croatia or Slovenia, in Slovenia in this case, in this area, okay? And they said, these are the ones, and these are not. I examined the original document, so it's crazy if you think about it. So you got basically a group of politicians and from the military, and they just drew the lines like this. This is the border, okay? And in that occasion, in 1954, they removed, because the area was divided in occupation zone by the Allies, Zone A and Zone B, which was actually under Yugoslavia. But what they did in 1954, suddenly they decided to move the border they decided to move the border by a few hundred meters, literally. Okay, when exchanging. So this is exactly what they did. They sit at a table, total ignorance, this is the border. And you see it in Africa all the time, these things, okay? We see it everywhere. Wherever you actually have complete ignorance and you draw borders, you have troubles later on, in generations. So, what happened is the communities all of a sudden found themselves in a completely different area. What do? So they got the schools, and all against all the odds, in a small little village, okay, which is not the current school, by the way, they decided yet to actually continue with the tradition of having the schools in Italian, or if you want Italian schools, if people like call it that way. Whatever you want to call them in any way, they can carry on against international treaties, against the law. But the interesting thing, it went on through the hardest periods. Up to a point in the 1980s, there was the teacher, the teacher's daughter, and another child in the whole school, just to keep it open. And they sold off more or less everything to keep it going. But the interesting story, and I'm nearly finished, is that after decades where the school, more or less, the illegal school in the village of Asteris was not meant to be there, at the beginning of this new century, just before Slovenia joined the European Union, in fact, the school started attracting attention from Italy. So why? Because people changed their mindset. Before the evil Slavs are no longer the evil Slavs, and they become part of the European community, so to speak, And people from Muggia in Italy decided, okay, why don't we send our children to the schools in Slovenia so they can learn our language? But what school are we sending them to? We're going to send them to the school meant for the Italian national community. It's complicated. A lot of international schools exist. This is not an international school, okay? This is a state school. There are a lot of projects across borders where people go, no, this is not about this. This is the oddness of this is that the school which is meant for the Italian national community in Slovenia to attract people from Italy Okay? And then it explodes. Everybody suddenly in Muggia, they cannot fill the schools because they send them to the Italian school in Slovenia. Okay? And they have a lot of other problems because they start, the Slovenian majority, the municipality says, oh, this is a burden for us. Are you with me? So there's a lot of, I'm not saying they have wars, but, who pays for this at the end of the day? So they created a new school. It's amazing when I went to see them, they even produce olive oil on top of the hill. This is an amazing place. But to put into perspective, so you need to actually go against international law, I'm going to finish, to actually maintain what you think is your culture, in other words, okay? It's not just about the language, by the way. But the other interesting thing here is that when you look at it from the outside, you realize that history books are written just for the powerful. So what we mean by when you learn history, you're not learning history, you're brainwashed with ideas. Because it's enough to actually, to go and meet people who are not in power to realize that the world is not just black and white. Are you with me? So it's shocking. Of course, there are people who believe, there should be borders. In 2015, they put a barbed wire on the border between Slovenia and Croatia, a border which has been contested, and I'll deal with it as well, because Croatia and Slovenia always arguing about that border, sea border and land border, still today. Okay, but I haven't got the time to go through it. But the interesting thing is when you go and meet local people, and then you see what journalists tend to write, you think, who's the liar here? Okay, so I'll leave it with this question. So we only have 5 minutes. If you want to ask questions now, I'm ready for that.
I see what you mean on an individualistic level, but isn't there something like a collective consciousness, a consensus, an instinct for people to identify with a larger community?
It's a difficult question. Okay, it's difficult to answer because I think some people will say yes, and other people say, for example, in Croatia, nationality is not necessarily linked to citizenship. In other words, you have to declare at birth that your children are Italian nationals, but they're not Italian citizens, or they could be Japanese. If you want, you can call them Japanese or Renault, as I said. So Renault is an extreme case, but their passport is Croatian. Doesn't make any sense. But the parents had to declare the nationality, which is not coincide with the passport necessarily. It could coincide. It could also be something else. Okay. So to answer your question is, I think it's a difficult thing to say I need to declare them myself. I think in my opinion, we're brainwashed from above to say you're either with us or against us. It's because we think in categories too much.
What I meant was, I think people have a certain attachment to territory,
Oh, yes.
to their own customs, which they cherish.
Yeah.
That's what
Yes, true. But the problem is,
and therefore they do identify with a region and perhaps even with a race.
oh, yeah, good point. The latter I think is a bit too much there. But I think the region, for example, regional identity in Istria is something very recent. A lot of people these days identify as Istrian, which doesn't mean Croatian, it doesn't mean Slovenian, it doesn't mean Italian. So there is a new construction. As you say, they're all artificial constructs, if you want. Okay, so we have to be careful. But a lot of people stay in these places. I met a person whose family never moved from the same house, and the house changed country several times between 1918 to these days. So nothing moved from there. It was done in an interview, but they kept changing state. So what they identify with is their house. They identify with the animals and the house, but not. They didn't care very much about which country it was. This is where the difficulty is. But I agree with you.
Customs as well. People are aware that things are done this way in this region, but they're done differently in another region. But we prefer things as they are here, for example.
Well, I come from Lincolnshire, and it's different from here.
It is.
But there is a border there, isn't there?
Not Laos.
I just want to pick up on that because it does strike me that it can be quite difficult, I think, for British people to comprehend this aspect of life in Europe, and you can see it happening actually in Ukraine with kind of, I suspect over the next 5 years, populations moving across the enforced border that's been imposed by Putin. I think we find it difficult to understand because we're an island, and our borders are decided by the North Sea and the Irish Sea. It strikes me it's only until you get to the north of Ireland where you get anything near this with, over the last 100 years, people that have moved from the north of Ireland to the south because of religion or the other way around.
It's a good point. I think this is exactly, I think, what led possibly to the decisions of draw lines for borders, everywhere in the world, but particularly in that area in 1947 and 1954. You draw a line and you just push people around. And all the people care about is their properties, or if they own the property, or the land, their olive groves or vines. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid I went over I had to be careful because it's 1 o'clock, so I apologise for going over the limit, and I can't.
Well, thanks for hanging on in there. This is